Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by Loughborough University. This podcast seeks to bring together the worlds of academia and professional practice. If you're interested in the latest research and trends in sport, then this is the podcast for you. Today, I'm with Dr. Russel Seymour and Dr. Maddie Orr, and we're here to talk about sustainability in sport. Russel was the first sustainability manager at a major UK sports venue, Lord's Cricket Ground. He worked with the MCC for 19 years, overseeing the transition to 100% renewable energy, and founded the British Association for Sustainable Sport in 2010. He's widely regarded as the leading UK voice on sustainability in sport. Maddie is a lecturer in the Institute of Sport Business at Loughborough University, London. She's the founder and co-director of the Sport Ecology Group, an international consortium of academics who drive climate action in the sports sector through research and public education initiatives. Her seminal research in sports ecology examines the impact of climate change on the sports sector, with a focus on the resilience and adaptation in outdoor sports. Dr. Orr's community work includes serving as the chair of steering committee for Green Sports Day in Canada, the sustainability lead on the Commonwealth Sport for Development and Peace Youth Network, the creator of the Students and Scholars Deck, and the co-founder of Rock Your Cause workshops. Her research has appeared in the Globe and Mail, ESPN, BBC, TSN and CBC. Dr. Orr's work in the sports sustainability movement has been recognised by the North American Association of Environmental Education, 30 Under 30, Class of 2020, Corporate Knights Magazine 30 Under 30 in Sustainability Leadership, Class of 2020, and the Forbes 30 Under 30 list in 2021. Hi Maddie, hi Russ, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us, it's going to be fun.
Yeah, thank you, look forward to it.
Today I know we're going to talk about sustainable sport, but just to give a background, can you guys just give us a brief introduction into how you got involved in this world, starting with yourself, Maddie?
Sure. So I came into this actually from the ski world almost 10 years ago now. I was working in the French Alps and we had some pretty bad seasons in terms of snow. And I started to look around and think, yeah, this is going to continue happening and we're going to continue seeing the impacts of climate change on sport. And it won't just be snow sport, it'll be all sports at some point. So being a total nerd, I went back to school and started digging into these questions at the University of Minnesota in my PhD, and had a phenomenal team there who trained me up in natural resource science and kinesiology. And now I am going to be heading up the new Sustainable Sport Business program here at Loughborough University on the London campus, starting in October 2022.
Russ, could you introduce yourself and your background, please?
Yeah, of course. I came to this from a slightly different angle, I guess. I was an academic biologist. My background is in ecology, environmental sciences, conservation biology, that sort of thing. My PhD was actually in giraffe conservation, believe it or not. But I was teaching, and one of my students said to me one day, "Do you like cricket?" And I do. So I said yes, and he said, "Well, they need match day stewards at Lord's Cricket Ground." So I actually started my sporting career was as a match day steward working at Lord's Cricket Ground just over 20 years ago. After a few years, I got a full-time job at Lord's, so I worked in sports management. And because of my background, because of my environmental sciences background, I started to look at things like our carbon footprint, our waste management processes, recycling, etc. Took a report to the chief executive, who basically said, "This is important. Would you like a full-time role?" So I then became the first sustainability manager at a major UK sports venue. That was back in about 2007, 2008. And I'm now chief executive of an organisation called BASIS, the British Association for Sustainable Sport.
Amazing. I'm sure we'll touch upon things around all your experiences shortly. Just so I can add, like we talked about the Alps with Maddie, I've got in my office here, I don't know if you can see it on this, you can't really, oh, there you go. Look, me and my wife have popped up for you both. So I also like cricket. And that was a picture of me and my wife at the Boxing Day Test 2010 at the MCG. Now, if you do remember that day, it was amazing because we bowled Australia all out for 98. And then, according to my picture here, we were 157 for none at the end of that day.
Weren't they good days?
I wanted to bring it up because obviously we're getting stuffed in the Ashes right now. So I just thought I'd remind everybody that we have been a very good cricket team in the past.
We have indeed, yeah.
So to move on and actually talk about what we should be here to talk about, I know you both attended COP26. So can we touch upon that and let us know kind of what happened there and what are the implications for sport?
Yeah, shall I jump in first? I was there to actually promote or talk about being part of a documentary around climate change in cricket specifically. So we did that back in the summer, and it's a 15-minute documentary that looks at the implications specifically for that sport, specifically for cricket. But I think in general, the implications from COP26, you could look at it either way. Some people were disappointed. Some people thought it was good progress. And I think in terms of a political process, it was actually probably fairly positive. These things are these international agreements, they're always incremental. There's never going to be something really groundbreaking there. And I'll admit beforehand, I was probably at the point of really on a wave of optimism, thinking this was a real key moment in terms of climate change and climate change policy. So some disappointments in that it didn't quite match up to what it was billed to be, but progress came from COP26. And we've got to remember this is a big international political gathering. And we've just got to keep moving and making sure it improves each time these meetings happen. And it is a continuous thing. These meetings happen every year. And if improvements happen every time, there should be positives coming out from it.
And are there any specific positives, Maddie, that you feel came out from COP26?
Yeah, I have to echo what Russ was saying, right? I think all these political events are designed to move slowly when people don't necessarily agree and to move very quickly when they do. And so I think we did see some really positive outcomes in terms of reporting. So for example, we now have every government has to come back annually with new commitments and new goals. Previously, they had to do that every 5 years. And so we're going to start to see a trickle down effect from that reporting schedule on everything, I would expect, quite soon. And I expect we're going to have, governments turning to organizations like sports to say, we need you along for the ride. We need you to comply with these new goals and to align. And from a sport perspective, specifically, we did see the UN roll out a new set of goals for the Sport for Climate Action Framework, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point in this conversation. But they have new standards now that organizations have to commit to or drop off of the framework. And that's going to be, I think, quite promising moving forward to see that kind of commitment coming from big names like FIFA, for example, and the IOC.
And I think if I can just jump back in again, we focus on COP and the piece that is newsworthy, if you like, as reported, is those political discussions. But there's a whole other circus that goes on around COP, which is the events that happen. For example, the one I mentioned I was involved in. But so many things happen at these COP meetings. And I think previously, the Paris meeting in 2015, where the Paris Agreement came from, there are maybe 3, 4, 5 meetings around that talked about sport or were sport specific. Not so many in Poland in a couple of years ago, but in Glasgow just a few months ago, I think there were 25, 30 meetings that were really focusing on sport in some context, in some way. So the involvement that we have as a sector has really increased and is being noticed internationally and politically moving forward. So sports profile in this whole climate area has really increased.
I think the awareness has certainly been raised hugely, and that hopefully in the future we can see more and more impact from people. I think we'll probably discuss some of those shortly. So in terms of the impact of the climate and sport and the relationship between the two, what impacts has the climate had so far on sport? So Russ, you mentioned there about cricket. So have you got some specific examples?
There are so many. These are all sort of weather-related examples. And look, the attribution now, the scientific attribution of climate events, that it is from climate change, from human-induced climate changes, is pretty clear. It's pretty much unequivocal now. So if we look at extreme weather events and impacts on sport, they're fairly significant. The sorts of things that we're looking at in terms of extreme weather would be flooding, would be extreme heat. We can possibly include wildfires into that. We can include storms in there. So just examples in terms of cricket, somewhere like Worcester as a cricket club is regularly flooded. We're looking at more flooding events around in the UK specifically. rain events, a club like Glamorgan in South Wales, they lost nearly £1 million in revenue back in 2017 because of rain-affected matches. So, financial impacts of these sorts of things as well. In South Africa, back in 2017, cricket was pretty much stopped, apart from a professional level, because of a drought making the pitches so hard that they were dangerous to actually play on. We've had hurricanes going through the Caribbean and, impacting on Test match cricket grounds for the West Indies. But it's not just the infrastructure, it's not just the venues that are affected by this. Look, we've already talked about cricket. Joe Root in the Sydney Test match in 2018, he batted through an entire day. Again, a good cricketing performance by an England batsman, but he batted through the entire day in that Sydney Test match in 2018. Outside the ground, the temperature was 47 degrees centigrade. Now, remember, he's in full cricket pads, batting for 6 hours. The peak temperature in the middle during that match was 57.6 degrees centigrade. It was a peak temperature, didn't maintain that, but 57 degrees centigrade. And we're expecting our athletes to perform in those kind of extremes of temperature. And extreme temperatures is characteristic for climate change. And it isn't just the players. For example, the hottest temperature in the UK ever recorded, 38.7 degrees. There was a test match being played at Lord's Cricket Ground. Ireland's first test match, in fact, playing at Lord's. And in that match, I was still working at Lord's at the time. In that match, more than double the normal number of people going for first aid treatment had to go for first aid. And there were nearly 200 medical referrals for heat issues. So there's a duty of care to spectators as well. So there's a whole range, everything from hurricanes hitting a ground through flooding to heat impacts on individual players, but also on your spectators as well. So cricket is almost a microcosm of climate change impacts, all these things that can happen. And given the countries across the world as well that play cricket, it almost exemplifies all of these potential impacts from climate change.
Oh, brilliant. I wasn't expecting so many amazing examples, and both in the UK, in South Africa, all around the world, these impacts are making a difference, just as you say, in the microcosm of just cricket. Maddie, I know you've got lots of other kind of different examples, so do you want to bring in some of those for us?
Sure. So I guess I'll start kind of in Tokyo in 2021, it's Tokyo 2020, but played in 2021, and work backwards a little bit. So Tokyo 2021 had over 24 events delayed or postponed by more than 2 hours because of extreme heat. And chief amongst them was the gold medal game for women's football, which kind of caused the whole world to kind of pay attention to what was going on. They had more than double the number of athletes seeking medical attention at their outdoor events, particularly cycling and marathon. Because of that heat. The same event actually got hit with a hurricane right in the middle, but it was a tropical storm by the time it made landing on Tokyo. And so we saw a number of events postponed and a couple of actually surfing competitions canceled. So a few of the heats later in the day just got canceled outright and they got advanced. There were some issues previously in Tokyo with, and Japan, the surrounding region, with hurricanes and typhoons. Typhoons is what they call them if they're in the Pacific, but typhoons during the Rugby World Cup in 2019. And there's some really stark images. If you Google them, they're pretty impressive, of athletes from different countries literally walking through like 3 feet of water to get to the pitch. So they were able to drain the pitch, but not the stands, which is kind of funny. There's, issues going back in winter sport, obviously, all the way back to the 70s. So we have lost in North America, on average, 1 day per year since the 1970s. So we're looking at about 40 days less to 50 days less of snow in the average year, which is a considerable amount. And that really puts a strain on athletes because we're now asking them to perform the same number of competitions in a much shorter span of time. And so what happens is obviously, you get stress injuries, you get a mental health impact of having to be at peak performance for, 4 weeks, because that's the only amount of time that you can do all 12 or whatever races that you have to do. And you're jumping all around the world to different resorts to do it. And so that's been an issue. Obviously, on the snow sports side as well, there's the whole issue around, whether there's snow at all. In some cases, there isn't. And so it's a case of artificial snow, which is a good solution if it's cold enough. But if it isn't cold, you're not getting that either. And so that's been an issue across winter sports. And we're going to see it in Beijing. This will be the first Olympics to be 100% reliant on artificial snow. There's a big report dropping on January 24th of this year on that topic, actually. A number of athletes quite concerned about the conditions there. Also in Beijing in 2008, if you go back, we don't often tie in air quality when we talk about climate change, but it's so important to talk about air quality when we talk about climate change, because these things go together. And, you know, the news headlines for Beijing in 2008 were all about the smog and the smoke and the bad conditions around air. This is common. And there's a number of organizations in sport who are working to fix this, but, you know, it's still going to be an up. And I think it's going to be the next 10, 15 years. This will be top of mind.
So amazing examples, again, from a variety of sports showing the impact that's happening. Now, how do we think this is going to go in the future? I mean, we all presuming this is going in one direction. So have you got any predictions for the future?
I mean, my big prediction for the future is there's going to just be more adaptation happening. I don't necessarily know that we're going to start seeing different climate trends, because I'm not seeing the kind of mass reductions in emissions that we would need to see in order to see significant changes in the weather. But I do think organizations are going to get smarter about how they adapt. And by that, I mean, you know, we're going to start to see more heat policies come into play, where there's a maximum temperature that the officials will allow athletes to compete in. I think we're going to start to see more flexibility around dates of competition. So, you know, when you look at a calendar for a ski season or a football fixtures schedule or whatever it is, I think we might see like the ideal date and then the next day as a plan B, particularly in sports like cricket or skiing, where more often than not, you're starting to see challenges. And I think that there's going to be much, much, much more awareness needed around the risks, particularly related to health. And I think we're going to start to hear that from the sports medicine community. And when that happens, you know, rule changes, what have you, you know, I think we could start to see different pitches. I think like all kinds of technology is going to come into play.
And I completely agree with that. I think it's going to be about adaptation. You know, sport isn't necessarily in a position to, we can raise awareness, absolutely. And we can be a trusted ambassador around this, because we're going to be impacted by these changes. You know, the examples that Maddie and I have given, this is already happening, and that's probably only going to increase in terms of these major events. So it will be around adaptation and how we make those changes. And sport can talk about these issues as well. I think one point of concern, you know, we're primarily talking about elite athletes. We're talking about big events, but it's going to impact on participation as well. And the way that youngsters come into the game. You know, we've just talked about air quality. If your first experience of sport at a really young age is that you've been running around and you feel wheezy and you feel uncomfortable, and that's primarily an air quality issue, you've got a negative experience almost immediately. So let's continue our conversation primarily around that professional sport. But I think just in the back of mind, let's think about how young people are recruited into playing. You know, what are their experiences of this? Even playing in excessive heat or whichever way around. So there's all sorts of dimensions to how sport will need to adapt around a lot of these issues.
I think also, just to piggyback on that last point, it's really important when we think about climate change to remember that different places will be impacted differently. But for the most part, poorer countries, places closer to the equator, developing nations will be hit first and worst. And that's already happening. And so the implications in terms of opportunities for sport to be played in places like Africa, Central America, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, where the impacts of climate change are already quite severe, is going to be enormous. I think we're going to start to see, for example, in like the Horn of Africa, where the majority of medalists in long distance running have come from traditionally, right? Kenya, Eritrea, Ethiopia. They've topped the podium for 10 years in world championship marathons. I don't know if that's going to continue to be possible if they continue to see extreme heat and drought the way they have in the past years, because the young athletes coming up in that system are not having the same opportunities to play and participate in the ways that previous generations have. And so there's a pipeline issue around the world, and there's an equity issue around this as well.
It's a really, really fascinating insight regarding both professional sport and participation. And you know, they're clearly going to be heavily impacted. Just kind of switching it up a little bit, I suppose, in that we've discussed how the climate affects sport. Can we flip it a little bit and see, well, how does sport contribute to climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, you can argue that the sports sector has a relatively low impact. Look, if you compare us to the, you know, oil exploration and petrochemical industries and all that kind of thing, you know, it almost doesn't compare. And that's not to say there isn't an issue here that sport needs to address. It partly depends on the scope that you're looking at. Are we looking at the major venues? in which case, you can measure your carbon footprint, you can bring it down as far as you can. But then also, where does this scope go? Do you then include the fan travel? Do you include all the manufacturing? Do you include the replica kits and everything that goes with it? Sport brings together so many other elements of society in terms of travel, in terms of food production and food and beverage events, etc. But participation sport, we've already touched on it, but the carbon footprint of taking your kids to play football, to play rugby, to play cricket, all year round. Some parents, if they got kids that are, one's a swimmer, one's a rugby player, and one plays something else, they're driving around almost non-stop. If you start to add those things up in connection with sport, suddenly you're talking about quite a big footprint. So there are opportunities, if you think about where you play, how you travel to those events, what you do when you get there. And then that implies that there are opportunities for the clubs and the venues to actually try and adapt and really raise awareness for this. I think the biggest impact that the major clubs can have, but also the recreational clubs, is to actually talk about these issues. And like I said before, we've got this opportunity to be in a really responsible position that we know we're going to be impacted by some of these issues. So we can talk about it in a non-political way. It's not a campaigning organisation talking about this. It's a sport that you love is saying we're going to be impacted and we should be taking some actions. So yes, we contribute. Absolutely, we contribute. But we've got this huge opportunity to talk to people about this, make it normal, make this conversation accessible, and say, let's try and do something about it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that the best way I've heard this framed, and I don't even know who to attribute this to, I wish I did, but is that, sport has a footprint to take care of. And I tend to subscribe to the notion that there's an opportunity there and a responsibility to do your part, whatever that is, but not necessarily to take on the whole world with it. But there's also, so there's the footprint, but simultaneously there's the brain print of sport. There's the imagination that it captures amongst the fans and the traditions and the culture that's built around it. And I think that's such a rich consciousness to tap into, that if sport can use this, like Russ said, to start a conversation among fans, among participants around, we can take care of our own backyards. I think that really goes a long way. So, minimizing footprint, increasing brain print around sport and climate has to kind of be the next steps. And I think there's organizations working to that. There's been a lot of progress in recent years, so I hope we'll get to talk about that a little bit on this podcast as well.
And I think I was just going to jump in again, the opportunity is there because there is so much positivity around sport. People do it because they're passionate. People do it because they love it. And look, you've got to respect this, but it means that there's a real opportunity to target people while they're kind of in that euphoric state, if you like. And if you can link positive messages around climate change and actions you can take and link it to that already positive feeling. Like I say, it's got to be done responsibly and intelligently, but link into that passion and that euphoria and that enjoyment and that fun they've already got, and put these messages in, and you've got a much stronger link than simply somebody on the news, a bad news story about flooding or temperatures or whatever. That's kind of negative. Link it to something positive in people's lives, and now, be more positive and take that on board, I think. So huge opportunity for sport to do something around this.
Brilliant. I think there's two kind of key things that come out for me there. One regarding, so what are we actually doing within sport? But then also, how are we utilising the brand of sport to increase awareness and increase impact?
I think so. For the last 15, 20 years, right around actually when Russ started working at Laird's Cricket Ground, there's been a steady uptick in sport organizations recognizing climate change as an issue and signing on to do something about it. Now that looks different in different places. In some cases, it's literally been LED lights and recycling. In other places, it's been far more invested in terms of, we have Climate Pledge Arena now in the US that is committed to much, much more than just LED lights and recycling. They're into fan travel, and they're into a stadium that's basically made from almost all recycled goods, and their food is coming locally. Everything that you can do is being done there. I think that there's a good trend also of organizations pushing each other to do more. And we started to see that with the Sport for Climate Action framework when it really kind of got big in 2019. So it was launched in 2018, got much bigger in 2019, 2020. And in those couple of years, there started to be more media coverage of this, and therefore more interest by organizations to really take it on. And so we've started to see things like Sky's Summer of Sustainable Sport, right? And they did, a carbon zero game, one of the biggest games of the summer. They have covered this, they did a whole entire week of it around COP26, which was really excellent. I think Russ was involved in some of that on the back end, which is great. And so having the media, having Sport for Climate Action Framework amplifying these efforts has created a bit of a who can do it better amongst the clubs, amongst the teams. And I think that competitiveness, that friendly competition is kind of fun and has really pushed it forward quite a lot. I'll let Russ pick it up from there.
Yeah, look, I totally endorse everything Maddie said, and all those positive messages are absolutely there. But I'm going to flip it over slightly and say, but there is a lot more that we can do. Yeah. Really good examples there. But it's quite variable, to be honest. There are some clubs that have really picked it up and are doing a lot of clubs, venues that are doing it, and at all levels. This isn't purely Premier League football or first class cricket, whatever. There are some really good recreational teams out there, or lower league teams that have taken this on board, usually driven by an individual, somebody near the top who said this is really important. But I think we also need to reflect the position of society more generally. Sport sits within our general society, and we are where we are, and we've got to this position through various reasons. Nobody ever sat there and said, wouldn't it be great to really kind of screw up the atmosphere and cause climate change? It's just things happen. We progressed in a certain way, but we're now at a point where we can say, you know what, some of those experiments really didn't work. The amount of single-use plastic we now use, yes, it was convenient. Wasn't it nice to not have to take things back and, we could just throw something away? But we've now got to the point where that's getting ridiculous, and we're getting all this plastics in the oceans and all this kind of thing. So all these things have happened for kind of a reason, and society accepted them, but we're now at the point where we can turn that around and say it's no longer acceptable. And sport has a huge opportunity in there. So yes, there are some really good examples, and I think we need to be able to reflect on that, communicate that back, and actually just make this normal behaviour. The sport in general, but our clubs and our venues will do these things. It's about reusing cutlery and cups, etc. Don't just throw things away. Reduce that footprint. Go switch to renewable energy. Look at your water provisions. All these kind of things that can be looked at, and just make sure that we improve.
I'll add two things off the back of that. One, if you're from Loughborough University and you're listening to this, we are signed on to the Sport for Climate Action Framework. So check out our sustainability page, find out how you can participate in that. There will be more conversations on this moving forward in the new year. So think through that if you're in the sport program, if you're involved in any way in Loughborough sport. And second, if you look at the Sport for Climate Action Framework, and we've talked about it around it a little bit now, but there are about 300 signatories to it. If you think about how many sport organizations there are in the world at every level, that is a drop in the bucket. It is nothing. It's basically nothing. So while I am so enthusiastic about all the organizations that have taken it on and have taken the initiative to get involved in some way, whether they're signed on or not and just doing it independently, that's fine. There are way, way, way more organizations out there that have not even started thinking about this yet. And so there is so much work to do.
Definitely. And, as you mentioned, Loughborough Sport there, I think we've spoken previously about this, and maybe getting some undergrads or postgrads involved in some things around what we do at Loughborough, I think could certainly have an impact locally. And as you keep mentioning, it's not just about these big organisations. It is about what we can do as individuals. So, with that in mind, what is there that let's go for what is there that national governing bodies can do? What is there that professional sports organisations can do? And what is there that individual fans can do to help in this arena?
For me, a huge part of it is awareness. It's almost sort of educate yourself, understand what these issues are and see what you can do. I think one key thing that we should say is sport has lots of positive impacts. Look, we know that, and people listening to this will know all the positive things in terms of societal impacts, economic impacts. So we've just got to find a balance whereby we're minimising the environmental negatives and we're maximising all of the positives that sit with sport. So there's never any suggestion that sport should not happen. Look, the most sustainable event that you could possibly do is the one that doesn't happen, if you like. It's a weird way of saying it. I think there is a role for governing bodies and to actually start to probably very soon start to mandate certain things in terms of funding, for recreational clubs, making sure that there's information out there. So when clubs update their facilities, they're actually operating to the best standards they possibly can. Again, there are far more recreational clubs out there than there are professional clubs. So, if we get in rainwater capture, if we can put in air source heat pumps and efficiencies, making sure that they're well insulated, the lighting systems, etc. All those practical things that really also sit under sort of planning regulations and that kind of thing. But then also increase awareness amongst the participants and the fans. Get people, can you go in a shared minibus or car sharing? These are relatively simple things that you can do. Reduce your water by putting aerators on your shower heads. All kinds of things that sit in there. But it's you probably need a dedicated person who really wants to look at this. And I'd imagine that most clubs probably will have somebody who will put their hand up, say at the general meeting, we want to look at sustainability issues like carbon footprint. There'll be that geeky person there who says, you know what, I'm interested in that and I'd like to do something, I'm passionate. And they'd probably get on and do it, to be honest. So lots and lots that you can do, but it's about educating yourself, not beating yourself up about the position you are in now, but taking a positive approach saying we want to change a few things.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Russ said. Awareness is going to be a really big part of it. I think on the action side of kind of what tangible actions can we take right now at every level, if you look at the biggest impact an individual has versus a sport organization versus a university for that matter, travel is top of the list almost always. Almost always. And so if you think about ways to address travel, whether you're an organization and that means you're implementing carpooling practices for your team to get to where they're going, whether you're a sport federation and you're thinking about the calendars so that teams are traveling on the road kind of in the same area for a while, as opposed to, for example, flying from London to Edinburgh, back to London, over to Ireland, back to London, over to wherever. If we can limit that travel, not limit travel, not eliminate it, but reorganize it so that there's not as much kind of point A to point B, back to point A, to point C, back to point A, to point D, back to point A, when that can be better organized. I think that's really going to be something we have to look at. I think, I've hammered on about this in the US for ages, but anybody who's heard me kind of on ESPN has heard me say this. We've kind of gotten to the point where we have agreed as a sports world that it's all right for an athlete to be in the air for about 6-7 hours on a flight from, for example, New York to Los Angeles, or from London to Qatar if they're going to play a game kind of in the Middle East, and back and play the next day. We've gotten to that point. If we agree that that's about the reasonable amount of time for a single fixture competition that they can travel, I think it's reasonable to say they can do it on the ground too. So if instead, if we were to drop a radius around London and say we can reasonably have them on the ground if it's 3 hours or less or 4 hours or less of ground travel instead of taking a flight, I think that goes a really long way in reducing emissions overall. And it's something that, the argument they get back is, oh, okay, well, it's less flashy. Yes, but it's the right thing to do. Oh, well, it's less comfortable. Is it though? We can have the best buses in the world. They can be flashy and cool. Everybody gets their own TV, whatever. But it would go a long way, I think, in reducing that footprint. And then for the individual standpoint, from the fan or the parent of a kid who's, in sport or whoever it is, travel really is the number one way to reduce your footprint. And so whether that's, taking the bus, taking your bike, finding ways, and this is going to be important, to store kit at sports facilities so that you're not taking it to and from the facility and therefore requiring a vehicle. That's going to be really important moving forward as well. So my big one would just be think about the travel component. Anything you can do to reduce it is a move in the right direction. It's going to be a long process, but I think we will get there in the end without eliminating the interregional and international aspect of competition that keeps it so fun.
There's endless examples there. That's brilliant. Where could people go to look and find some of these examples for where they could practically make an impact? Whether that's somebody who's listening from a national governing body or a pro club or an individual. We have people listen to this podcast who are alumni from all around the world working in these organizations. So is there somewhere they can go to actually find out more of what they could do?
If they're in Britain, they should go to BASIS's website.
Yeah,
for
I was going to
promotion.
jump. I kind of paused on that one because I'm just now thinking exactly what is on the website that would be directly relevant to recreational clubs, and I think I now need to add a clear page on there, which does have that. I know that Sport England has a page on sustainable clubs. You know, we do have some information, but I'm going to update it now just because of this conversation. But Sport England has information up on clubs. My recollection is it's primarily about how the venue functions in terms of setting up your clubhouse more than anything. So it's probably more, general reading around what these issues would be and how you can actually make those changes. I apologize. I can't actually pinpoint and say here is a page which will give you all the answers.
I think if you're a student, the Sport Ecology Group website has a page for students that has, a document that has 100 things you can do as an individual to be more sustainable. So go check that out. See how many you can check off in the next year. You can make it a New Year's resolution. If you're an educator, if you're a professor, an academic, there's a page for you as well on the Sport Ecology Group website, sportecology.org. Teaching resources, sample slide decks, all the research that's been done in this area is collated there. And then there's a resources page for industry professionals on the Sport Ecology website as well. We update it annually with just best practice that we've seen. So there's basis examples on there, but there's also work from various international sport federations, the International Olympic Committee, World Wildlife Fund, the United Nations, a number of other reputable organizations. So we've kind of stacked them there in case you're looking for kind of a best practice or a how-to guide on where to start.
That's a good place to start. And I think prior to this conversation, we spoke about the Sport for Climate Action framework. And I think you were mentioning that case studies and more examples are going to be coming to that soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my understanding is it's a work in progress. The hard part about the UN, right, is that it's designed to work slowly. And so they've got really good people there working on this. But unfortunately, like all sports, they are understaffed and pretty strapped in terms of how to prioritize what has to get done first. So at the moment, they're building how-to guides on a number of different things, but they haven't come out yet. And there will also be, I think, coming summer 2022, a Sport for Nature initiative launching under the United Nations Environment Program. BASIS has been awesome in helping us to kind of get that ball rolling as well. And Loughborough is the lead partner on that. So look for that. That will be coming out in summer of 2022 with a little bit more guidance as well in terms of that nature and biodiversity aspect.
Brilliant. So we've given some practical kind of examples of where people can go to. And we've obviously just now touched upon students. Obviously, as a lecturer at Loughborough as well, and someone who does deliver a lot of experiential learning, can you provide us with an example of what we can do? Because this generation coming through really do seem like the advocates for pushing something forward. So I know that you've got a paper out, I'm looking at it right now, of leveraging sport as a venue and vehicle for transformative sustainability learning. Can you enlighten us a little bit on that? So if there's professors out there or lecturers out there who want to take this on and lead more sustainable or develop more sustainable students, what kind of things could they do? Yeah,
there's a number of options here. And the kind of entry point that I like to always give people is do a site tour, preferably with an organization that has a sustainability person on staff, because that person will join the tour and they're usually so excited to show what they've accomplished. And so as you walk around the pitch or you walk around the locker room, they're going to be pointing out, here's the compost and here's the lighting situation and here's where we collect rainwater, or whatever it is. And I know a number of organizations in London and elsewhere that have done these. They're very encouraging. So it's a good kind of entry point for students to wrap their heads around. What does this look like in practice? And to see firsthand, like, here's a career in this that might be there for you on the other side if you were interested in pursuing, for example, the Sustainable Sport Business Program or our sport management programs, the graduate level. We will be feeding into those kinds of roles. Another option is to do live labs or case studies, which is where a professor or a lecturer might find a partner in an organization. It's very much like a collaborative project. I know collaborate is the big kind of theme at Loughborough at the moment, but where you might partner with an organization like Arsenal, for example, or Chelsea, and say, we would love to solve a problem for you when it comes to sustainability. So Mike Lloyd at Arsenal might turn around and say, here's something that is a sticking point for us at the moment. And it might be something as simple as we need to sort out plastic beer mugs, or it could be something like, we need to find grant opportunities for our lighting, or whatever it is, that the students can really turn around and dig into the pragmatics of what it takes to become a sustainable facility, a sustainable sport organization. And in that process, they not only get to connect with these organizations, feel close to the problem, but find solutions that exist both within a theoretical realm, as they'll have to kind of engage that, but in a practical sense as well. And so it's a really kind of hands-on approach, more appropriate, I would say, for a grad level or kind of an upper year undergraduate, but usually quite enriching for the students.
It's very much what I do in my program for the experiential learning side. And I think we may talk offline about how we may look at that at Loughborough.
Absolutely.
Guys, really appreciated your conversation. We're going to just draw it to a close, but really appreciate it. I hope, and I'm sure the listeners will have appreciated it too. Thanks for being on. I will speak to you both soon.
Thanks for having us. This is fun.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Always a pleasure to have a chat with Maddie, and to talk about sustainable sport is wonderful. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to Experts in Sport. If you'd like to get in touch to discuss any topics that you'd like to hear about, then contact me, Martin Foster, via my email m.foster@elborough.ac.uk. Bye for now. See you next time.